right. So let everybody file into the webinar. Welcome to Powerhouse Arena's virtual events. My name is Chris. I'm the events coordinator. And tonight we're hosting the launch for Time of the Magicians by Wolfram Eilenberger. He'll be in conversation with Yascha Mounk. You can buy the book at powerhousebookstores.com. The link is in the event page, and I'll post it here too. I'll introduce Yascha and Wolfram now. Yascha Mounk is one of the world's leading experts on the crisis of liberal democracy and the rise of populism. He's the author of 3 books, including most recently, The People versus Democracy. He's an associate professor of the practice of international affairs at Johns Hopkins University, a contributing editor of The Atlantic, founder of Persuasion publication and online community, and the host of the Good Fight podcast. Wolfram Eilenberger is an internationally best-selling author and philosopher. He is the founding editor of Philosophy magazine. Time of the Magicians was an instant bestseller in Germany, Italy, and Spain, and is being translated into more than 20 languages. He has been a prolific contributor of essays and articles to many publications, including Die Zeit, Der Spiegel, and Cicero, and taught at the University of Toronto, Indiana University, and University of Arts, Berlin. And I'll hand it over now.
Great. Well, listen, it's a real pleasure to be leading this conversation with Wolfram, who is an old friend of mine. And I have to say, Wolfram, when I first heard about your book, I thought, what? Why? And then I started reading it, and it's just so wonderfully engrossing. But it did make me think, you know, what gave you the idea for this book, for combining these 4 pretty different philosophers from each other and finding a way of both, you know, doing serious intellectual history, but managing to tell the story in a way that frankly feels like a beach read?
Well, essentially, it's a book about 4 extraordinary human beings and 10 extraordinary years. The 4 human beings are arguably the most influential philosophers of the German tongue in the 20th century. And the 10 years are the roaring 20s in Europe, especially in Berlin and Paris, also in Moscow. And everyone knows that these 10 years between 1919 and 1929 had something special about them in terms of cultural creativity, intensity, fear, anxiety also. So I was interested how the zeitgeist and the political situation of that time interacted with the biography of my heroes, which were highly talented young men at the time, traumatized by the Great War to different extents. And they had to find a way for themselves to find a new life, a new existence, a new profession, and ultimately a new way of doing philosophy, which they did.
So the American edition has a lovely cover. I have to say I like it very much. And the title is, you know, the decade that reinvented philosophy. I think it's interesting that you know, when we think about what made our moment, we still think back to World War II. We think back to the reconstituting moment of Western politics, especially in Europe after World War II. But we think less about World War I and its legacy, and we think less about the 20s, other than as the cause of fascism and the cause of the rise of Hitler and so on, right? How do you think the 1920s have this lasting significance in our intellectual life, or perhaps even in our political life?
It's true, especially if you talk about the German-speaking world, that the legacy of the 1930s, this dark legacy, overshadows everything that was happened before. But the 1920s in that culture were, you know, a burst of creativity that was never seen afterwards or before. And just think of physics, Einstein, Heisenberg, that all happened basically during the 20s, of architecture, the Bauhaus. Think of literature, Döblin, Kafka, there was Proust, Hemingway, Fitzgerald, Virginia Woolf. I could go on for a very long time. So I guess it's undeniable that there's a special moment in the history of thought. And this is true not only, but also for philosophy. And the 4 heroes of my book, Ludwig Wittgenstein, Martin Heidegger, Walter Benjamin, Ernst Cassirer, they basically, I would argue, and actually that's the title of the book, reinvented philosophy as we know it today. I would even argue that they created all of the schools that dominate public and academic philosophy to the present day. So it was an unusual time, and understanding the 20s in many ways, I think, goes a long way in understanding our present situation too.
So what's interesting is that they reinvented philosophy, and for people who don't know as much about the history of philosophy, it might sound as though the claim is that these four influences came together to create one school of philosophy that somehow was constituted by before. But that's not exactly what you're saying, right? I mean, they reinvented philosophy each in their own way, and perhaps you can trace a lot of philosophical activity today to those different strands, but it's not. It's not sort of the four influences went into one thing that is today. So tell me a little bit about how they were in conversation with each other, and how they sort of were trying to create rival ways of doing philosophy, right?
Yes, I mean, it's not a group biography because these four heroes didn't form a group. It's rather a typology of four different philosophical temperaments, four different human beings who reacted to the very same situation and the very same question in very different ways. So what was the situation? The situation was a German-speaking culture at that time in Austria and in Germany was in a turmoil. Actually, the World War was lost. There were two empires in meltdown. There was civil unrest, even civil war, inflation, loss of public order for many years. But there was also a civilizational crisis, I would say, in terms that the fundament of what it meant to do philosophy, which had been stable for 150 years after Immanuel Kant, had lost every credibility, or the credibility that it had due to innovations in science, like Einstein, due to the atrocities of the World War. So these young men had, I would say, they would face a triple challenge. They would have to reinvent themselves as human beings after the war. They would have to find a new way of what they believe in and how to argue. And they would have to reinvent what it means to do philosophy, because at that time, academic philosophy was a rather boring and stagnating field. So they have a lot
very
of energy.
hard to imagine that from today's vantage point.
No, I mean, the parallel in that sense is also striking. And they set out basically to work with the old Kantian question, what does it mean to be a human being? And they give from a shared intuition that language plays a vital role in answering that questions. They would develop the major schools that we know today. I won't bore you or the people out there with too many isms and schools, but just think of Ludwig Wittgenstein, who is probably one of the founding figures of what we now call analytic philosophy, which is a dominant stream in philosophy, at least in the Anglo-Saxon world. Then there is Martin Heidegger, who is basically the founding father of three major schools of philosophy, like existentialism, hermeneutics, and I would even argue deconstruction. There is Walter Benjamin, who is the founding father of the critical school, or the Frankfurt School, which is highly influential in Europe and continental philosophy. And lastly, Ernst Cassirer, the forgotten giant of these four figures. He's basically created single-handedly a framework, what we now call cultural philosophy or cultural theory. So once you get a sense of what these people did, it's not only an exciting story, and they were not only exciting human beings and very interesting, peculiar human beings, you also have a sense of what's going on right now in philosophy. I don't know if that's a good thing, but nevertheless, it seems to be a fact. And of course, one could wonder what happened to philosophy within these 100 years. But I would think the last creative outburst, an explosion of thought, that happened during the 1920s and largely in Central Europe.
So one of the great things about this book is that it does actually take you inside those ideas. And for somebody, even for people who don't have a deep philosophical background, they can actually get a real sense of their work and how they're confronting these problems. And at the same time, it tells great character portraits and great stories about the lives that they led. And so, I don't know whether we can be equal to your book in this conversation. I think it'll be hard to combine those two as elegantly in a conversation as it's done in the book. But let's try. So why don't we go through sort of each of those figures, and both a little bit about their lives and a little bit about how that inflected how they thought about the world. Let's start with Ludwig Wittgenstein, for the sole reason that he's somebody I have a roundabout connection to, which is that I was a student at Trinity College, Cambridge, where he ended up being a fellow and a student, I suppose, at first. And the story about him goes that he hated the master of a college so much that he demanded to have the room that is most distant from the master's lodge, from sort of the president's house, I suppose, in American terms. And so, as luck would have it, one of my good friends in my first year there was assigned that room. So I spent many drunken evenings in Wittgenstein's rooms, which were not particularly nice, but they were in fact distant from the master's lodge. So he's clearly a quite difficult character, as even this one anecdote indicates. And certainly, I would say in academic mainstream philosophy today, he's probably the most influential. So tell us a little bit about who he is and how he responded to World War I, and how that's still influencing us today.
Well, yes, you said distance. He was a loner. He was a peculiar human being. He was born into a very rich, one of the richest families in Europe at that time, in Vienna, which was a cultural hub at that time too. He was brought up by private teachers. He basically didn't have much contact with what we would now call the real world. And then he studied engineering, where he developed a Jones for logic, one might say. And then I went to Cambridge to meet Bertrand Russell. And at that time, Wittgenstein was already very quickly identified as, in Russell's words, the next great hope of philosophy. He had a way with words. He was formally very strong, and he had also an uncommon depth as a human being, because he was a very troubled man, troubled by depression, by the feeling of loneliness, senselessness. And when the war broke out, he didn't have his BA, he was basically quitting studies, going to the war, facing action, shooting to kill, being in great danger all the time. And during those 4 years of the war, he was basically writing this first book of his, which is called the Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus, which then became to, this landmark, this legendary work, so influential for the philosophy of the 20th century. And the idea of the book is very simple. Wittgenstein tries to develop a criterion for distinguishing two kinds of sentences: those that can be meaningfully said by human beings, and those that appear to be meaningful but aren't.
And the second category is rather larger than the first, according to him.
It's very large. And
probably most things we've said so far fall into the second category.
I hope not, but when it comes to philosophy, the sad summary of that book, which is only 60 pages and very arcane, at least at first sight, is that every sentence that philosophers have claimed for 2,500 years as a sentence of philosophy proper is too meaningless to even be false, according to Wittgenstein. So Wittgenstein is basically trying to teach us that philosophy as we perceived it cannot be done, doesn't exist. And we have to kiss goodbye the very idea of doing philosophy as it was done for 2,500 years. It's a very extreme, more say violent approach, but at the same time, it's very soft, because he wants us to teach us to live a freer, clearer, and happier life by giving us a therapy and a way not to ask ourselves questions for which we won't find an answer in the first place. So it's a very existential philosophy, but made happen by very formal means.
So tell me just a little bit about that. What does it mean to claim that, all these great philosophers of the past, Descartes and Locke and Plato and so on, a lot of what they said actually had no meaning. I mean, it's not even wrong. It's just meaningless. I mean, that seems like a pretty extreme claim. And yet, as you're saying, it is continuing to influence academic philosophy in deep ways today. What's the reasoning there? What's his argument for saying that?
Well, the method is based on a new language that was invented at that time. It's basically the language of formal logic. There were great advances in the beginning of the 20th century. Wittgenstein worked with that. And then he created a theory of meaning, which basically came down to the very idea that every meaningful sentence is a picture of the way the world is. And the way the world is, how that is, science will tell us that. And every other way of claiming to make a meaningful statement is not fulfilling that very criterion. So in a sense, Wittgenstein says, what is the case? Science will tell us. And of all the other things, for example, the question of immortality of the soul, of God, what should I do, ethics, those are sentences that appear to be meaningful, but actually aren't, which is a big shock to a culture. But all of these four magicians, I think, have a very violent stance towards the history of their own discipline, because they really think that what has been done for 2,500 years before is basically a one-way street in the wrong direction. It's the same with Heidegger, who starts in 1920 then to claim, like a conceptual wrecking ball, if you will, that the way that we have done philosophy in the Western world for 2,500 years is simply fundamentally wrong-headed. So those are very strong characters, very ambitious characters, very talented ones, and they don't want to solve a small problem or a specific problem. They want to really reinvent what it means to do philosophy in the first place.
So Wittgenstein, claims that 2,500 years of philosophy should be flushed down the drains. He impresses people in Cambridge sufficiently that they sort of give him a PhD, even though he's never actually formally been enrolled. And there's a lovely scene that you describe.
Yes.
Sort of what that looks like. Perhaps you can tell us about that. And so, so what does he do then? I mean, he's. I mean, people in Cambridge recognize him as the most, important philosopher of his time. Does he spend the next decades as a university teacher, writing important books, or does he decide to, go off and do something crazy?
No, I mean, like all four of them, there's a, for Wittgenstein and for Heidegger and for Benjamin, philosophy is not an academic discipline. It's a way of life, and it's a life-transforming activity. This is what makes them so interesting to me, and which lends them to write a narrative book about them, because you cannot understand really why they do philosophy if you don't understand what it means to their existence. So Wittgenstein, after having finished this book in 1918, basically, and being convinced that he has solved, as he says, all essential questions of philosophy with that book, he leaves philosophy. He starts to study as a primary school teacher, and basically for the next 6 or 7 years, he teaches in a primary school in rural Austria, and tries to
terrorizes the children by all accounts.
Yes, but he's also a spiritual seeker. He was a very troubled man, suicidal during these years. So what he really wants to do is to have a clear mind, not to think about philosophy anymore, and do something that is, as he claims, so meaningless that he doesn't have to think of it. So he became a teacher. So no offense to the teachers that might be listening, but this is also the quirky humor that he has. But the fascinating thing during those 10 years is, of course, that his mind, as it were, is so much geared towards philosophy that he cannot stop doing it. Abstractly and in theory, it's clear to him that there's nothing to be done, but still the machine keeps on working. And then by 1929, he returns to Cambridge, taking his viva, his doctoral exam. And after that, he goes to Moore and Bertrand Russell, who are his examiners, and he touches them on the shoulders and says, "Don't worry, you will never understand it." And this is how he gets his PhD.
What was a move for somebody trying to pass his PhD dissertation? And it speaks to the character of those figures that they didn't take offense.
Yes, and Wittgenstein was not, a particularly socially adequate human being. I mean, there's discussion if he was even on what you would call in the US on the spectrum, if he was a case of Asperger, milder case maybe. But he was so determined and so sure of himself that he, saying to Russell or to G. Moore, which were really major figures at that time, "Don't worry, you will never understand it." He really meant that. He was quite aware of his capacities, the quality of his thinking, and he was not shy about it. And so he was a very difficult man to deal with, but everyone in Cambridge who was in contact with him wanted to make sure that this very special human being gets a chance of doing philosophy again, which he does then in 1929, and he starts to revolutionize his own thinking and Western philosophy again with his second big book, The Philosophical Investigations.
Great. Well, let's pass to a second figure who you've already mentioned, Martin Heidegger. A very different kind of character. Tell us about what he's up to in the 20s and how he continues to be influential.
He comes from a very poor peasant family of rural Germany, very Catholic upbringing. He studies with the church, wants to become a priest or a theologian. And he, from early on, he was identified as a kind of a Wunderkind, also a very socially dominant human being. And by 1919, he returns from the war. He didn't see much action. He was basically in geology and trying to find out how the winds go so that the German troops would know how to shoot at the French, at the Belgian front. So he comes back and he's basically penniless. He doesn't have a job. He's becoming a father, and he really wants to become a philosopher, but has no means of doing it. And for the next 5 or 6 years, you find Martin Heidegger in a very strange and difficult place, because his family basically has nothing to eat. They don't have any money. They have 2 small children, like many families in Germany at that time. But at the same time, he writes first parts of the book that made him famous and really changed the fate of the philosophy of the 20th century, Sein und Zeit, which will then be published by 1927. And in 1929, he returns to his hometown, Freiburg, and takes the chair of his teacher Edmund Husserl. And, from that on, there's, so to speak, the rest is history then, because in 1933, he joins the Nazi party and becomes the rector of the Freiburg University, claiming at that time that Adolf Hitler should be the fate and the only leader of the German people. So he's also an example of an ambitious man who tries to use his philosophy to legitimize the Nazi government at a certain time. And those are things that you can already see in the 1920s. You can see how that happens, but at the same time, it would be a very bold move to reduce Heidegger to that, because many of the things he thought during the 20s, especially in Sein und Zeit, were highly influential to figures like Hannah Arendt or Levinas. So he's, the book is called The Time of the Magicians, and magic is not always a good thing. And I think Heidegger is an example of the kind of dark magic that philosophy can be.
So Heidegger goes in 15 years from being penniless and unknown to being famous and very powerful. And obviously that's, as you were outlining, in good part because he makes I don't know, I guess morally terrible compromises with power, or perhaps he genuinely believes in that form of power. I don't know which of the two it is. Tell us about what is so forceful about his personality, and what is so new about his ideas that rapid ascent and transformation is possible.
Yeah, I mean, Heidegger was a very charismatic figure from early on, and he created a stage persona, as you can say, for himself. What we forget about sometimes in philosophy, how important performance is. Everyone who has had a great teacher knows that it's not only the arguments, but it's the person as such and the way he speaks and he performs. And Heidegger was really highly manipulative and gifted in that. So whenever he spoke, students were basically, it was to them like this prophet would speak, and he would find techniques of making that happen. But also, it's not only showmanship, it's also the substance of his thinking. And basically what Heidegger says is that modern philosophy from Descartes on has based its stakes on a certain idea of what a subject is, what it means to think, and how we relate to the world. And he thinks it's all wrong. He doesn't think that we as living human beings are subjects. He calls us Daseins, which is being there. He doesn't think that we have a problem of finding a way to the world, because he thinks we are already in this world. He doesn't think that there's a reality that we can fill with meaning and content, but he calls it an Umwelt, an environment, which is already speaking to us. So basically, he is changing the very basic vocabulary that we describe ourselves. He's creating a new anthropology, a new way of understanding ourselves. And his main idea is, if and to the extent that we describe ourselves in wrong concepts, we cannot lead a good life. We need the right conceptual tools to understand who we are, to understand what we should want as a culture. And the main claim, of course, which is then very influential for existentialism, is authenticity. We have to become authentic, real, honest human beings. And the dark side of this thought is that it is fear, especially the fear of death, that opens up the gate to every human being to become authentic. So he's very much open to the idea that it is the critical situations in human existence, the ones that we face death, that have a special philosophical meanings, and we should not shy away from them, but on the contrary, we should search them in order to find ourselves. I don't hear you right now.
Yeah, sorry, I was muted.
Okay.
One of my favorite anecdotes about philosophy and language is about an old scholar of Hegel's who rings up his English colleague, and he's already in his 80s, and he has very poor English, and he says, my good friend, I would like to learn English. Can you recommend me an English tutor? And his English scholar says, well, of course, I'll be happy to help you, but why on earth, at your age, have you decided to learn English? And response was, well, because I finally want to understand Hegel. And the idea is that, it is so full of terms and they're so hard to parse that every translator needs to have an interpretation of it. And so the translation actually makes it easier to understand in a certain kind of way. That's the sort of
same with Heidegger, maybe.
Well, so I read Heidegger both in German and in English, and I still am not quite sure that I understand it. Can you give us a sort of 2 or 3 minute what we should take out of Heidegger, or how it is that it does end up influencing figures like Sartre or more broadly sort of philosophical approaches today? Because my teachers in graduate school failed to do this, so I'm gonna set you the impossible task of doing better than them in 3 minutes, what they failed to do over the course of
okay. So this is Heidegger in 3 minutes. That's a risky business, but let's try. Let's assume that the basic question that he's asking himself is, what does it mean to be a human being? And the first answer that he gives, not for the first time, but it's very important to him, is that we are the only beings alive that know that we will die. We know that we are not going, I have a dog, for example. I like my dog very much, cognitively very able being.
You can't mention the dog and not show him to us. Now I feel like you should bring him out.
He's sleeping but the dog doesn't know that it will die. We will. From 5 years on, we have a feeling about this. So we know about our non-existence in existence. And Heidegger says there's a special human feeling or an emotion where this knowledge, which we usually don't like to think about, creeps up in us or creeps up on us. And that is fear. Fear is the very emotion when we have to face our finite existence in spite of ourselves, as it were. And with that fear, in Heidegger's terms, comes freedom. Because once we let that fear grow and face that fear, we understand that we are not wanted. There's no God who will save us. There is no meaning as such. It's just the freedom and the meaning that we give to ourselves. And in that way, Heidegger is really a forefather of the existentialists. That's their basic thought too. Basically celebrating fear as a gateway to find an authentic life, both as a human being and then also as a people and as an entire culture. And there you can see where it might lead, where there might be a way to the dark side. And that happened to Heidegger then in the 1930s when he changed the vocabulary from just one human being facing fear to an entire people, and an entire people searching for the authenticity. And this is where he was prone or to fall for the Nazi movement, because there are certain affinities obviously there.
And that's partially around this concept of authenticity, right? There's a long intellectual history of claiming that it's interesting that out of the four people you portraying, if I'm not wrong, 3 are Jews and 1 is a Nazi. It's kind of an interesting, it says something about, I suppose, intellectual life in Germany in the 1920s where people end up. But there's a long idea that Jewish cultural achievement is inauthentic. That is what Richard Wagner said about Jewish musicians, for example. So what to Heidegger is this concept of authenticity? And how, I suppose, does that shift, or how does that have the makings of pushing him towards the embrace of Nazism in the 30s?
Well, there's different ways to answer this, but the first answer is that no one can tell you what authenticity is. You have to make it happen yourself. It's a bit, nowadays it's almost a commonplace, when Nike says just do it, or in commercials we say be authentic.
You do you.
Yeah, or be all you can be, or things like that. This is a strange imperative, because no one knows really what to do. And with Heidegger, you have the same problem, but it's certainly clear to him what it means not to be authentic. And this is very much related to this underlying anti-Semitism that he cultivates from early on. For example, it's not authentic to care about money. It's not authentic to buy things. It's not authentic to be for capitalism. It's not authentic to live in a big city. So there are many ways to lose yourself, according to Heidegger. And not incidentally, all of these ways are connected inherently to the classical stereotypes of anti-Semitism at that time. And of course, he's also in a situation, in the 1920s in Germany, the war was lost. It was a highly problematic situation. There were two big nations that would dominate world culture, so they thought, Russia and America. And Heidegger was searching, as it were, for a third way between the communist and the capitalist alternative. And he really thought that this authentic German culture, which he takes a bit from Romanticism, the woods, the peasant life, the simple life, that would basically open up a way to a new alternative of being in the world. And that's his offer. It's an offer that many people made in the 1920s in Germany, but he was probably the most powerful and the most influential, because you don't see it that often that the book appears like Seine Zeit in 1927, and after only a few months, everyone agrees that something happened. We cannot do philosophy the same way afterwards. So it was really a meteoric event, that book, and that doesn't happen too often. So whatever you want to say about Heidegger, once you open up Seine Zeit and you read several pages, even if you don't understand right away, there's this power, there's this intensity, there's this poetic force that can really carry you away for the good or the worse.
So perhaps an interesting contrast is between Heidegger and Walter Benjamin, who's both, if Heidegger comes to prominence for one great work that has the claim to be very systematic, Benjamin never does one great work. I mean, in a way, we remember him for a whole series of different essays and fragments and so on. And he too is interested in some ways of authenticity, but has a very different notion of what that might be. Tell us about that.
It's true. It's true. I mean, Heidegger and Benjamin are an interesting story, and I tell that story in the book. I mean, they study together in Freiburg, and they hate each other from the very first moment, like non-identical twins. They both acknowledge that they might be very gifted, but they come from very different backgrounds. Benjamin coming from a Jewish family, a metropolitan family in Berlin, very rich, and then he goes against the wish of his father. He studies philosophy and then wants to become a cultural critic. So they know each other, and you're right. They have very similar longings, because they both think of modern life as a kind of a one-way street that would not like to follow, and they look for a new kind of a meaning and intensity. But Heidegger goes to the woods, he builds a hut of his own, he likes peasant life, whereas Benjamin, he throws himself into the big city novel of the 1920s with drugs, with acceleration, with gambling, with also prostitution. So he thinks that in this whirlwind of the 1920s, where everything is so fast and everything happens anew, he can find, as it were, a new mystical meaning to what life is, and he becomes one of the most perceptive, I would say, and most prophetic observers of modern city life as we know it, because he thinks once we take a second look under the surface of this city life, we can find very, very deep and timeless meaning that he relates curiously, I would say, also with a deep theological thinking of the Jews, especially concerning the meaning of language and science.
And I think sort of in a way it's hardest to think about the enduring relevance of Walter Benjamin because on the one hand, he's probably, along with Heidegger, the person who's still most read by a popular audience today. And actually there's been in some ways, I think, a renaissance of Benjamin in the last years. And, people feel like this is somehow a moment to which he speaks. At the same time, precisely because he's not a systematic philosopher in the way that somebody like Heidegger is, it's sort of much harder to explain what that lasting imprint or relevance is. How would you say that, the way that we think about the world is lastingly influenced by Benjamin's thought?
Well, I mean, I think there are two ways of answering this, because there's a Walter Benjamin of the 1930s and the 1920s. Most people who are now interested in Benjamin think of him as a left-wing cultural critic, which has some connection with Marxism. That's not so true of the 1920s. What he really does is he gives us a new understanding of what it means to be a critic of art. Like he revolutionizes the way that criticism is thought of. He thinks, for example, that the critic is as important as the writer. He thinks that a critic should not judge a work if it's good or bad, but should seek the truth in the work. So he writes his dissertations on the very idea of what it means to be a cultural critic. And I think by now, these very ideas of Benjamin are so commonplace that we don't realize how revolutionary they were. For example, that is an art critic.
You're saying that it's sort of an American form of a book review, which actually ironically doesn't really exist in Germany, right? In Germany, a book review is like an 800-word thing that's like, this is what the book says, and
yes.
Whereas in America, it puzzled me when I first came to the United States. When you look at the New York Review of Books, really it's just a series of excuses for essays on topics which are inspired by books to a certain extent, but which are ruminations about the topic and which try to get to a level of sophistication and insight about the topic, but the book that they use as the raw material actually don't, right? That's part of the conceit. And so you would say that that's a Benjaminian art form.
Absolutely. I mean, the New York Review of Books is probably a mothership of Benjaminian criticism, or was at least for a long time. And you could say, yeah, for example, the way that art criticism is understood in New York, I would say, basically they drank Benjamin with their mother milk without knowing it. It's true of all of these four heroes that their influence is so strong that we hardly notice it anymore. And the other thing with Benjamin is that he took popular culture and big city culture, and also, for example, movies or comics, philosophically seriously. So there was no part of culture that he would not deem worth of philosophical thought. So he, as you said, he was not a systematic thinker in the old sense that he tried to come up with, those are my premises, this is the argument, this is the solution. He was an observer. For him, philosophy was the art of description. And he would make that happen with anything. He could write about a glass, a new sneaker, a new commercial, and he would, in the way of a distillation, if that makes sense, find and describe what that tells about us and what does it tell about our current state of culture. So he, in that sense, he opened up a new way, I would say, of describing what it means to be a cultural being. And of course, he was also good friends with Theodor W. Adorno and the core circle of what then became the Frankfurt School, which then, of course, took a political turn. But at core, I would say, Benjamin is not so much a political figure, but an observer with a gift of unearthing things about ourselves that we largely and easily oversee.
So,
fail to notice.
So we were rounding out on 2 a.m. in Berlin. So thank you for, this is amazing, your stamina here. I think we need to do, anyway. we need to cover the last of his quartet. But after that, I'd really love to get some questions in from the audience before we let you go to sleep, Wolfram. So if you have any questions, please do put it in the chat. And I will pose it in your voice. But tell us about Cassirer, who sort of ironically, I guess I would say, as this book starts, I may be wrong about this, but I would say that, in 1920, Cassirer is probably the most famous of these figures and the most influential of these figures, the most established of these figures. And yet today, he's almost certainly the least well-known of these figures, right? What is he doing in this book? What's interesting about him? And what can we still sort of learn from him?
Well, he's the only established academic philosopher at that time. He's a major figure in academic thought. And it's, of course, important, and for me, important to say that neither Heidegger, Wittgenstein, or Benjamin thought of themselves as academic philosophers. On the contrary, they were fiercely anti-academic in their posture and in their longings. And Cassirer is also the only one that is, I would say, he's a Democrat, the only one of the four. He has a very affirmative and positive view of a liberal democracy, which is rare among German intellectuals in the 1920s. But all of this connects to his philosophy, which is a philosophy of pluralism. Basically, the idea or the answer to the question, what is a human being, that Cassirer gives is, we use languages. We are animal symbolicum. It is the sign use that makes us so distinct from any other being on this planet. And he says there are different ways to describe the world. There's English and there's French and there's Chinese, and each language shows us a different side of reality. And in the same way, there's the language of religion, of art, of physics, and of biology. And his basic intuition is that there is not one language to describe reality. We need the plurality of every language there is to get a sense of what might be real. In the English-speaking world, or in American philosophy, Nelson Goodman, for example, in his ways of world-making, made use of that very idea. But it's a philosophy of plurality, and it's because for Cassirer, democracy is nothing else but the process of bringing the different voices and languages in one culture together so they can mutually enlighten each other. And this is, I would think, still the big and important heritage of Cassirer. And you're right, he's largely forgotten by now. He's probably the last universal genius of the 1920s, at least in Germany. He wrote about Einstein, he wrote about biology, about art, about linguistics. So he was really well versed in almost every field of human endeavor. But he was not such a cult figure. He was very shy, he was moderate. He was trying to please everyone, whereas the other three were quite notorious and radical human beings. And also, and maybe that's the last point, is Heidegger, Wittgenstein, and Benjamin, they have a voice of their own. They have a sound. It takes you two sentences and you know, oh, this is Wittgenstein, this is Benjamin, this is Heidegger. Cassirer not. And for me, of course, and this is interesting to a writer, and the book that I wrote, I think is more of a writer's book than a philosopher's book. Language matters so much. The sound matters so much. And nowadays, I think in academic philosophy, we don't realize how important the poetic force of language is for philosophy. We don't teach pupils or students to write in a poetic, non-academic form, and thereby I think we impoverish the very idea of what philosophy is and should be. And if you think of the three heroes, Heidegger, Benjamin, and Wittgenstein, they were not only great philosophers, they were great poets. They had their way with the language in very distinct and idiosyncratic terms. And I think that is something that is also a legacy for our present times, because I fear that in academic philosophy nowadays, the very art or the very feel for language is being lost.
Yeah, I'm very struck by that, certainly having gone through grad school within the past decade, I suppose. I finished, certainly. And there is both a fear of things being too accessible. I mean, I think there is a sense that, language should be relatively clear and straightforward, but it shouldn't appeal to a broader audience. It should be directed very firmly at an academic audience. And I think there's some fear about actually publishing outside of academic venues. I mean, I certainly was advised not to do that.
Right.
Because that signaled a lack of commitment to the academic life rather than the life of somebody who tries to reach a sort of different or broader audience. Actually, I have two questions here. I mean, one is that, I mean, to what extent do you think, what does that look like in Europe? I mean, I think from America, it's tempting to think of Europe as a place where that's not the case, at least in places like France, that public engagement, especially by philosophers or by people who call themselves philosophers at least, is still a real sort of part of that intellectual landscape. And what do you think we lose to the extent that that constrains people?
Well, maybe the second question I will answer. That first, I think one of the striking features of present-day academic philosophy is the poverty of the form of writing. Basically, it's a 15-page article, and you are trained to do that. Now, that's a ridiculous format for anyone who wants to express himself or herself, right? We all know that. It's like making a chair, but you never get really, you don't start to think when you do that because you already are so confined by the very form. Now, if you think of the history of philosophy, there are novels, there are dramas, aphorisms, all kinds of forms of finding your voice in philosophy. And I think the first thing that we should change is this ridiculous reduction, which has to do with being, academic philosophy being an industry right now, where you have to publish in a certain format for certain venues. That's not conducive to good thinking. That's the first thing. And the other part of your question, of course, relates to the question of how to address a broader public philosophically. And I would say on both accounts, the academic career and the way that you're being taught at philosophy departments fails miserably right now.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I mean, I suppose that it's interesting, out of these four figures, two ended up becoming professors, if I'm not wrong. One starts the book off as a professor, one becomes a professor in the course of a book. Heidegger held some form of academic position, for I believe he was never a professor, and Benjamin failed to be accepted into the academic establishment. I mean, I sort of, have very torn feelings about the institution of tenure in the United States and the sort of equivalents that exist for it internationally, for that reason, where on the one hand, I think it's a very important social institution for granting academic freedom. And I do think that once people have tenure, they have a liberty to say things, whether they be politically unpopular or they simply be disagreeing with the dominant consensus in their field, which in many academic disciplines is the much more controversial thing to do. But I also have this fear that it gives people this reason to hold out until a very late stage, in the hope that one day they'll be free. I mean, I have so many friends from grad school who sort of said, well, I mean, I don't quite like this academic game and so on, but in the end, that's a smart thing to do. And, I will go and do what the discipline demands of me in my PhD, and I'll go and do what the discipline demands of me in my postdoc, and I'll certainly do it while I'm on the tenure track. Then one day I will have tenure and I'll be able to do whatever I want. But of course, by that time, you've been doing something in not your own voice for 20 years. And there are the examples of a political science professor who, the day he received tenure, announced that really he's interested in aliens and he's going to study aliens for the rest of his life. Right. But that's very, very rare, right? Like most people continue doing what they've been doing for the last 20 years. I mean, what is there a university culture we could create where people have real creative freedom, or are the people who are going to be remembered always going to be the ones who are sort of semi-outside of the university?
Well, look, I think the very phrasing of, then I will have the liberty or the freedom to do it, it's a ridiculous phrasing. And no one can give you the liberty if you don't take it. And I don't want to sound pompous in saying that, but, when we think of the four figures of the book, they didn't have much to eat, they didn't have money, there was really difficult times, but all four of them, because they had the inner energy to do it, wrote their stuff and basically found a way to make it happen. So the very approach of, when I become a professor, I will have the freedom to think, that's completely wrong-headed. And everyone who's heading in such a direction, I think, shouldn't study philosophy in the first place. So this is one part of it.
Well, perhaps this speaks to something else that I think is interesting, which is that You know, much as I loved reading the book, and much as I think that the characters in it are all winning in various ways, they are also, by today's standards, quite clearly assholes.
Yes.
And perhaps those two things are related, right? That actually, virtually by definition, in order to create something that's interesting and worthwhile and original, you have to butt up against the consensus of your time. Otherwise, you're not doing something that actually is meaningfully new or different. And that, you know, for most nice, normal people, the incentive is not to do that. You don't want to upset your friends too much. You don't want to get attacked too much. So you're much more influenced by your own times. And that perhaps the people who don't go along are the people who have difficult personalities. And that gives them difficult personalities in their personal as well as their professional lives. That doesn't seem to be how we think about things today, right? There's a little bit of a tendency to demand at least a certain moral goodness of people if we want them to be part of our discourse. But the book makes me think that there might be a tension here between us wanting the people who will actually challenge the discourse in a real way, and the people who have the good character that we ask of them.
Yes, I mean, you know, the conformity that is now expected is certainly not very conducive to doing good philosophy, and that has to do with the very terms of the trade, if you will. Because if you want to do philosophy on a systematic basis, that's a radical activity, and it doesn't mean that you seek consensus, you seek contrast. It doesn't mean that you agree, but you disagree, but not the shallow disagreement that is sometimes cultivated now on US or German campuses, but deep disagreement. If you take it a step further and say, I don't want only to profess, but to embody my ideas, then it becomes really difficult in real life, so to speak. And the book, I think, clearly shows that. So I think this conformism, it's a systematic conformism that is expected. It starts with the selection of people who get to study philosophy, who are accepted at the departments. And it has to do with the education they get there, especially the training in writing. And of course, they expect, you know, the very idea that philosophy, once you study it, is a career, is a really dangerous idea. And once you start now in a major school in the US or in Germany, you know what you will have to do in order to get tenure in 10 years. And I think once you're on that mindset, you should rather do something else.
Yeah, the word that I always bristled against the most when I was in grad school is this talk of professionalization, right? Like you all need to learn how to professionalize. And this is really sort of buzzword at the time. I always thought that's not why what I'm here for, right? I want to professionalize.
No one's. But you think of it like for the last 50 years, I think it's fair to say we're a time of stagnation in philosophy. At the same time, never have there been so many well-educated, so many well-paid, so many well-connected, so diverse philosophers who have produced so little of interest during the last 50 years of professional philosophy. So I think it really should give us, we should take time to think about that, because when we look back at the last 50 years, and I'm not making this up, I think everyone will agree, there's not one big work that we have reason to assume that in 250 years, people will look back to it as the Meditations or the Critique of Pure Reason or the Inquiry. You know, the last 50 years were very industrious, but they were not very creative in our field. Everyone acknowledges that. Everyone suffers from that, but especially the tenured people don't have much energy or will to change that, I feel.
Well, I guess, I mean, my instinct is to agree, but I also wonder how easy it is to tell. I mean, you know, if you were slapdash in 1925, in the middle of a decade you talk about, I guess you might have thought that Cassirer is going to last, and ironically, he's the one who lasted the least. You know, depending on sort of which side of the publication of Being and Time we're on, you may have thought that Heidegger is going to last, but, you know, for much of that decade, you would not have known about him, most likely. I suppose Wittgenstein in certain circles was already recognized as a really lasting importance. And certainly Benjamin, I think nobody would have thought that is the person who we're going to be decades from now, right? So do you have any ideas of people who we're undervaluing today who might last, or how we would go about identifying those?
right now, I would really be hard pressed to give you one name, and I would like to give you one name, but I'm not sure I could reasonably give one. But you're right. Maybe they're amongst us. What I certainly feel is the case is that the younger generation, probably your generation and the generation that is a bit younger, they are so frustrated by the very system that they are caught in, that there's a lot of energy, a lot of good energy. And my hunch is that if we see a new beginning or, a new event in philosophy, which I think will happen at some time, probably not within academia, but from a person that is approaching philosophy from outside academia, that would be my hunch, because within academia, you're so hard pressed to work as the system wants you to work and write, that innovation is almost impossible, it seems to me.
What about the link between political events and philosophical productivity? Now, of course, there are some great philosophers who lived through relatively calm times. I mean, Immanuel Kant, ends up his life as the French Revolution is coming, and he's sort of excited by it. But the bulk of his productivity was before that. He was living, out in Königsberg, very far away from anybody else. He did not have a politically exciting life. I think it's fair to say. So there's some counterexamples, but certainly a lot of the great philosophers, and certainly a lot of the great political philosophers, are great in part because they are the ones who make sense of a changed world. And that certainly seems to be true of these four figures, whether they're directly engaging with politics or indirectly trying to digest the experiences of World War I. The traumatic events of a lifetime sort of gave him a leg up in discarding some of what came before and rethinking it. So is that somewhere where we might look, for an explanation of a stagnancy of analytical philosophy in the last 50 or so years, and perhaps why, with all of the complicated political events that are happening now, and all of a sort of sudden feeling of a real change in political paradigms, you might look to new thought through that?
Yeah, I mean, as a question, you could say, is catastrophe the mother of modern philosophy? And a plausible answer is yes. The book is based on a very simple premise, if you will. The premise is times of crisis are good for philosophy, because then things open up and people have the bodily need almost to rethink everything, and that's what philosophers should do. So when we apply this to our present situation, it's tempting to think that something will happen very soon, especially eventually in the US. At the same time, people are I think it's hard to overestimate the cultural irrelevance of analytic philosophy nowadays. They are holed up in their own departments within academia, and they have not much to give to the broader public. So I do think it has also to do with the very idea of analytic philosophy as it is taught and still exists. And people, I think, are there in a kind of a valley of death. People with very small problems, very refined, that no one really cares about, not even the people who write about it. So people need to break out, and I hope the younger generation will.
Well, the cliched line goes that in China people wish may you live in interesting times as a form of curse. I relate to it because I do think that I would much rather live in uninteresting times. My family has lived in interesting historical times for too many generations, and it hasn't tended to go well for them. So I would much rather live in uninteresting times. But since that does not appear to be a privilege that we're going to enjoy, since it certainly feels as though we are increasingly in interesting times and headed towards more interesting times, I guess we can at least take your remarks as inspiration for using those in order to do some interesting thinking. But before we do that thinking, and before the times get too interesting, I just want to recommend to everybody again to buy and read the book. It really is a rare mixture of a book that's serious and insightful and just a lot of fun to read. And you've all seen what an interesting guy Wolfram is. So thank you to all for coming to this event, and thank you to Wolfram for writing this wonderful book. Go get some sleep, and I'll leave it to Powerhouse Arena to take over.
Okay, thank you, Yascha. Thank you.
Thank you. That was very enlightening. Thank you so much to Wolfram and to Yascha. And if you missed the event for any reason, I will have it on YouTube soon. And
oh, okay.
Oh, we don't have to have it.
Well, no, I mean, Yascha, are you still there?
I'm here. I'm here.
Okay, like was it like did it make sense to some extent to you?
That's great.
Because this conversation about the future of philosophy, I think I don't know how much it's so difficult to address this right now when people try to defund humanities all over the US, right? So it's an iffy timing. But I wonder if I make this up myself or if you have the same feeling about this, and if there would be a way to start a conversation about this.
No, I mean, I think it's true that humanities are self-marginalizing in all kinds of ways, in the language they use, in in certain ways politically as well. Now, I think there's sort of two things going on. I mean, one of them is humanities departments getting defunded at some of the bigger state schools and so on, and I think that is a concern. But the bigger problem is simply that nobody's taking humanities courses. I mean, when you look at the incoming majors at the big universities and the most prestigious universities, just the number of people who want to go into humanities department is much lower than earlier. And frankly, but it doesn't exactly have the same courses, but it has related courses. It has something to do with the fact that those departments aren't not only bad at speaking to the general audience, they're bad at speaking to incoming freshmen at some of the most prestigious schools as well. And so some of it might be some governor in Kansas wanting to defund the humanities at Kansas State, which is certainly a problem. But a lot of it is just organic. The students just aren't going to those departments. And so university presidents, many of whom are actually trained in the humanities, say, well, if that's not where the students are, that's not what we're going to fund. And both of those are problems that will only change if the humanities change.
Okay, yeah. But, the book is, of course, about giving inspiration that there are other ways to do philosophy than in your normal academia. Okay, but thank you for this lively and good questions. I hope we managed somehow, and I will go to sleep now.
Yeah, I thought it was great.
Okay, thank you, and hope we see you again. And once you're in Europe, please let me know. Okay.
I will.
Thank you, sir. Yes, sir. Bye bye.